So today we're going to talk about the basic procedures for how you would collect pasture samples. So some of the tools you would need to take your pasture samples. One of the first tools you're going to need is some kind of measuring tool to measure sward height. And remember, this is sward with an A and not sword like the medieval tool. So you can use a plate meter, which if you're in a research setting, that would definitely be what you would use, either a falling plate meter or a rising plate meter. However, if you're at home or for a producer, you might just use a yardstick or a grazing stick. You'll also need a tool for clipping the samples. So this can be something like hedge trimmers, either electric or mechanical, or again, if you're at home or for a producer, that might just be something as simple as scissors. The last thing you're going to need is a container or containers in order to collect your samples, and this can be as easy as resealable plastic bags that are labeled, or to make things a little simpler, sometimes you can just use the trash bag. You can tie that into your belt loop, and as you walk around, put the forage in the bag, and when you're done, you can mix it up and then move it into a plastic bag as needed. So here's our example pasture. And this is what we would love our pastures to look like. So we have our entrance point down in the bottom left corner, our gate, and then the rest of the pasture is just grass. One important thing that I haven't drawn on here is a water source. And obviously, depending on your setup, that may have a permanent location or be moved throughout the pasture. The main reason for showing the gate is just so we have some frame of reference of how we're orienting the pasture. So when we want to take a sample of this pasture, as with anything else, any analysis you do is only going to be as good as the sample you send in. So we don't just want to take a sample from one spot in the pasture or just walk to the middle of the pasture and take a sample. We want to get a sample that's going to represent the whole pasture. So because of this, we want to walk in a Z pattern or M pattern, W, depending on who you ask, to collect multiple subsamples that we would then composite. So you would start maybe by your gate, walk across to one side, walk back down to the other side, and then walk over to the other side again. And as you go along, you're going to be taking samples. And so for this example, we're going to talk about a modified version of something called the step point method. So the way this works is that you take a designated number of steps, usually maybe 10 or 20, and when you stop, whatever the point of your boot or shoe is pointing at, that is what you would then record the composition or take a sample. So it's important to stop with whatever foot you stopped on and try to be consistent there. So for our example, we might walk 10 steps and then take a sample here, walk another 10 steps and take a sample here, and then so on, all the way through the rest of our pattern. And as you're doing this, you want to take notes as you go. So you would set up your notepad to reflect the same pattern that you're walking in so that you can take notes for each sample as you move along. But remember, we're not just trying to measure how much grass is there, we're looking at quantity and quality. So we're not just taking a sample or just writing a note about what kind of plant is there, but we need to do all of the measurements. So at every single step along the way, you need to write down what you see. So this example would be super easy. Every single spot would just be grass, right? You also need to measure sward height using your plate meter or your grazing stick, whatever it might be. And then after you've done those two things, so recorded the composition and measured the height, then you would take a sample. So that's what you would do at every single step. And remember, because pasture has a very high moisture content, at the end of the day, if you weren't going to send your samples off right away, you would need to freeze them. So again, this example is really easy because it's all grass. But is that really realistic? So in real life, a lot of pastures look more like this, right? So we still have our gate here to help orient you. And there is a lot of grass, but there's also some dirt patches, some rocks, some weeds, and maybe some other plants. So in this example, I'm going to say that these other plants are something like crabgrass. So how do you decide if that's a weed or not? Well, there's different answers depending on who you ask. But in my book, And in the book of Dr. S, that's going to be depending on whether the animal eats it. So if it's something that animal is going to graze, we're not going to treat it like a weed because it's going to be part of the diet composition that they're taking in. But if it's something that animal is not going to eat, then we're going to treat it like a true weed. So now we have our pasture with our dirt and our rocks and all, and we're going to use the same process that we discussed. So we're going to use our Z pattern or M pattern and take our designated steps, whatever the toe of the boot's pointing at, write it down, measure the sword height, and take a sample. But can we take a sample at every one of the steps we have here? No. So if we look, we have 5 spots that are going to be potential issues here. So first we'll look at these 2 purple spots. So there's one on the left-hand side and one down towards the bottom. And these are both spots where our step point ended us in a pile of that crabgrass. So we definitely need to write down what it is, but are we going to take a sample of that? Again, it depends on if that's what the animal is eating or not. Because if that's something the animal is eating, then yes, we need to include that in our sample so that our dietary composition is as accurate as it can be. But if they're not eating it, then including that sample would make our dietary composition inaccurate. And remember, if we do take a sample, whether it's grass, crabgrass, whatever it might be, we're only going to trim down to grazing height because our animals are not going to graze all the way to the ground. So we're only going to clip at grazing height, which will vary with the species and the type of plant, but usually is going to be hopefully no closer to the ground than 3 to 4 inches if our pastures are being managed properly. The next spot we're going to look at is our 2 blue spots here. So our dirt pile. So this would be an example where we take a note of what is there, but we're not going to take a sample. Similarly, our green spots now, or our 1 green spot, is a weed. So a true weed that the animal is not going to eat. So we're going to note what it is, but we're not going to take a sample. And obviously the same thing for our rocks, we're not going to take a sample. So after we did our first pass or our first arrow across the pasture, our notepad might look something like this. So on the areas where it's just grass, so maybe this is a fescue pasture. So areas where we just had our regular grass or fescue, you'll notice all I wrote down was the sward height, and obviously I would have taken a sample. On our crabgrass area, I wrote what it was and also a height because that's not our typical grass. But then for our 2 dirt areas, all I had was a designation of D for dirt, but no samples would have been taken there. So after we've completed this process, what does our overall composition look like just based on our samples? So our samples would tell us that our regular grass, so we said maybe this is fescue in our example, was 14 of the 20 samples that we took. Our crabgrass was 2 of the 20 samples that we took. So overall, assuming our animals are going to graze this crabgrass, that's a total grass composition of 16 out of 20. Our dirt was 2 of our 20 samples, and then we had a sample each of rocks and weeds. So how does this pan out in terms of percentage? So looking at the samples we took, our composition tells us we had 70% regular grass, 10% crabgrass, for a total of 80% total grass. We had 10% dirt, and 5% rocks, and 5% weeds. Now, these are just from our samples, but do we think this is pretty accurate for the pasture as a whole? Well, let's overlay a 10 by 10 grid. So now we have 100 squares. And does this look pretty representative? So based on our numbers, about 10 squares of this pasture are filled with dirt. And I'd say that's pretty close to accurate. Additionally, about 10 of those squares are crabgrass. That also looks pretty reasonable. About 5 of those squares are rocks, which I'd say is close to spot on. And about 5 of those squares are weeds, or the little yellow flowers in our example here. And the rest would be grass. So overall, our sampling, by using that Z pattern and the point step or step point method, we got a pretty representative picture of what the pasture is as a whole. And that is why we use these representative sampling techniques.